Well, good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this seminar, which is organized by the Iran Heritage Foundation with the help of Bijan Rouhani. And I'd like to say straight away, the event's been generously sponsored by Lipman Karas, and I'm very grateful to Jeremy Scott, wherever he is, for arranging that. I think the first question to be asked is, why is the Iran Heritage Foundation organizing this seminar? There's an easy answer to that question, really, which is that every organization, museum, university, or foundation with an interest in the cultural heritage of the Middle East should be organizing seminars and events to draw attention to the appalling destruction of cultural heritage that we've witnessed during the last few years. But more specifically, Iran's a part of the region and to some extent enjoys a shared cultural heritage with neighboring countries. For example, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus and consolidated by Darius, covered the whole of the ancient Near East and surrounding areas between 550 and 530 BC. And as you all know, the empire stretched right across to the Mediterranean and North Africa. And many sites and monuments in the region do date from the Achaemenid period, to some extent even Babylon itself, which the Achaemenid kings turned into one of their capitals. And Achaemenid influence stretched far and wide, perhaps even as far as Greece, with some people claiming that Persian influence can even be detected in the Parthenon friezes on the Acropolis. Then in Parthian and Sasanian times, that's between the 1st and the 6th centuries AD, the boundary between the Parthian and Sasanian empires, and firstly Rome and then Byzantium, was effectively on the river Euphrates, and there's considerable Parthian influence at sites like Hatra, Palmyra, and Dura Europos, and Ctesiphon. So I thought I had a slide there of Ctesiphon, but it's disappeared. Ctesiphon in Iraq was a major center. In fact, the palace of Khusro or Khosrows. Then, of course, we've got the Shiite shrines in Iraq of Karbala, Najaf, Samarra, and Khardamen. And not only are these places of pilgrimage for Shiites, but when the Golden Dome of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra was badly damaged by bombs in 2006, it is reputed that the Iranian government offered to help with the rebuilding. So evidently then, Iran has extensive interests in the wider region, cultural, religious, political, and even military. Well, what of the situation in Iran itself? Fortunately, there hasn't in recent years been deliberate damage to monuments of the type that we've seen in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and North Africa. But there are Sunni minorities in some parts of the country that could possibly become radicalized, and there's some history of incitement to violence. For example, at the beginning of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Ayatollah Khalkhali threatened to destroy Persepolis, Takhti Jamshid, the Achaemenid capital, one of the most spectacular sites in the whole of the ancient world. But there was strong resistance from local people who blockaded the surrounding roads and threatened to meet violence with violence if any attempt was made at destruction. So such resistance is obviously very gratifying, and one hopes that this kind of thing bodes well for the future, but obviously there's no room for complacency. Well, although there's been no recent incidences of deliberate damage or iconoclasm in Iran, it did occasionally happen in the past, even at Persepolis, where figures on the north wing of the Apadana, the palace of Darius, were defaced during the medieval period. It was this wing of the Apadana which has been exposed for centuries. The better preserved wing that you see now at Persepolis was only excavated in the 1930s. But damage like this was very much the exception rather than the rule. In modern times, damage to Iranian cultural heritage has come about through factors other than deliberate destruction. And we may start with environmental damage. As is well known, Iran's facing an unprecedented environmental crisis. And to draw attention to that, the Iran Heritage Foundation organized in January 2014 a conference on Iran's natural heritage, and that was masterminded by Mariam Alakband. Well, the harmful effects of adverse environmental conditions on cultural heritage weren't specifically touched on during the conference, but they are many, as is well known. Air pollution in Iran is at dangerously high levels, and this atmospheric pollution and the resultant acid rain, combined with the sandstorms that are now a regular feature in Iran, have had a very noticeable and very bad effect on historical buildings, archaeological monuments, and rock carvings. Sasanian rock reliefs at places like Bishapur have been particularly badly affected, and there are even signs of erosion on the great rock relief of Darius at Bisatun near Kermanshah. And then we've got the mismanagement of water resources. There are 200 dams already in Iran, and a further 85 are currently being planned. And you don't need to be an archaeologist to appreciate that this causes great damage to the archaeological landscape, with many sites being submerged or washed away. Well, apart from the environmental problems, other factors that are detrimental to cultural heritage in Iran, at least, are neglect, vandalism, intensive farming to meet the needs of a rapidly expanding population, and development. And the latter is a particular problem with unbridled development taking place in every part of Iran. It's actually a problem that affects the whole of the region, but particularly Iran, and it's even affected Isfahan. And some of you will remember that UNESCO recently threatened to withdraw World Heritage status from the Maidan at Isfahan if the proposed development of a high-rise hotel went ahead in the vicinity. And lastly, there's the problem of the antiques and antiquities trade that will be discussed later in the context of other parts of the Middle East and ISIS. It's been, I have to say, a particular problem in Iran since the 1920s and 1930s, and up until 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Iran was actually the worst affected country in the region. It's still a major problem, I should say, and nobody should underestimate the negative effect that dealer excavations and looting have had on our understanding of the cultural heritage of Iran. Well, in spite of all this, the situation now in Iran is much better than in neighboring countries. The patrimony is reasonably well protected, and there are currently 19 UNESCO-designated World Heritage Sites in Iran. Well, I want to turn now to the main subject of the seminar, which is the destruction of monuments and memory in the Middle East. As we've said in the introductory statement for the conference, the last couple of years have seen the destruction of cultural heritage in the Middle East on an unprecedented scale, almost without parallel in the history of the world. At an IHF conference in January of this year, the cultural heritage of Iran, that was the title of the seminar. This subject was touched on then, but since that time, the situation has sharply deteriorated, so that during the year, we've seen the destruction of Nimrud and Hatra in Iraq, the trashing of the Mosul Museum, extensive damage associated with humanitarian horrors at Palmyra, and, of course, much damage in Yemen and in Libya. Well, today's conference really divides into 6 parts. First of all, we've got setting the scene, where we're going to review what's happened in Iraq, Syria, North Africa, and Yemen. And I hope that we'll also attempt to assess the severity of the damage, and there will, I think, be some updates on the latest situation. And as we speak, events are rapidly unfolding in Libya. The second part of the conference is really about the ideology of ISIS, and this is a subject that various conferences and many commentators have shied away from, but it is, of course, something that should be investigated. Are all members of ISIS, for example, driven by religious fervor, or are they simply opportunists? A contact in Mosul wrote to me that he said, "I personally believe they are mercenaries from all different countries looking for money and women. However that may be, what can we say about the destruction of the intangible heritage, about the destruction of memory?" And this certainly seems to be part of the motivation. Then the third section of the conference is really about military engagement in the region and the illicit trade in antiquities, and there'll be views here from both the establishment in the form of museums and the police and the trade. And it'll be interesting to see if they believe there's any credence in the claims that ISIS is being partly funded by profits from the illicit trade. The fourth area is the media reaction. What we're looking for here is to see how the media has reacted to this appalling destruction of cultural heritage, whether the coverage has been adequate and appropriate. One problem here, of course, is that people become blasé, accustomed to bad news and disasters, so that the news of each new one is a little less shocking than the last one. And there are also some commentators who've sought to play down the scale of the disaster. For example, after expressing outrage about the destruction of Nimrud on the BBC Today programme, I was taken to task by no less a person than the historian Simon Sharma on the front page of the Financial Times, who expressed the view that some people, i.e. me, whose name he mentioned, were overreacting, and that far worse damage had been done in England at the time of the Reformation in the 16th century. And I hope this is something that we might touch on. Then the fifth point is the international reaction and the response. How have different communities reacted to the news, and have the responses from cultural and academic organisations being adequate and appropriate? Are we doing everything that we could do? And then lastly, there'll be a concluding session when there'll be a panel discussion with 4 people, and I hope we'll be able then to pick up on some of the points that have been raised in the seminar, perhaps attempt to offer a few conclusions, and there'll be opportunity then for people who want to contribute to the proceedings to do so, and there'll also be a Q&A session at that time. So I think that's enough by way of an introduction, and now I'd like to call on the chairman of the Iran Heritage Foundation, Vahid Alakband, who's going to open the proceedings. Vahid.